Her feet barely touched the ground. When the rope jerked her forward, the stranger stepped into the dust, unarmed, and said, "That's enough." The words were stones dropped in a silent well. They didn't echo. They sank. The sun, a merciless white coin in a bleached sky, seemed to pause in its climb. Dust motes, golden and alive, froze in the air between the adobe storefronts of Ascension. The heat was a physical presence, a weight on the shoulders and a pressure behind the eyes. It baked the mud brick walls until they radiated a low, shimmering hum. It cooked the smell of stale beer, hot iron, and unwashed bodies into the very air one had to breathe. And into this thick, suffocating stillness, the girl was being pulled. The rope was tied not to the saddle horn but lower, to the cincha ring, so every lurch of the horse was a direct, brutal command. It bit into the raw flesh of her wrists, already bound tight with twine. She was maybe 16, maybe younger, her body a whip-thin collection of angles beneath a torn cotton shift that had once been the color of cornflowers. Now it was the color of the road. Her hair, a black river of tangles, was matted with sweat and dirt. She stumbled, her bare feet finding no purchase in the loose scree and pulverized dung of the street. Each time she fell to her knees, the man on the horse would slow, not out of mercy, but to prolong it, to let the crowd see. Then he would cluck his tongue, a wet, satisfied sound, and the horse would surge, snapping her airborne for a moment before her toes scraped the ground again. The crowd was a beast with many eyes and a single silent throat. They stood in the slivers of shade offered by the wooden awnings, leaning against posts, their faces impassive or grimly entertained. Women in faded calico, men in sweat-stiffened denim, their expressions shuttered. They were here for market day, for supplies, for a brief escape from the crushing solitude of their homesteads and claims, and this was part of the price of admission. This was how Ascension kept its order. A lesson. A spectacle. The man on the horse was named Cale. He wore a plainsman's hat, the brim curled from sun and rain, and a leather vest over a shirt dark with sweat. His face was a mask of bored authority, his eyes small and deep-set, scanning the onlookers with a proprietary air. He was a deputy of sorts, though the star pinned to his vest was tarnished, and his authority came more from the colt at his hip and the weight of his employer, the man who owned the mercantile, the saloon, and the water rights for 20 miles. The other man, walking alongside the horse, was younger, with a fuzz of beard on his cheeks and an eagerness to please that sat poorly on his face. He carried a coiled bullwhip, tapping it against his thigh, a promise he hadn't yet been asked to keep. His name was Jetty. "Stole 3 tins of peaches," Cale announced to the street, his voice lazy and loud, "from Mr. Abernathy's own pantry." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the ground. "She's 10-day, this one. Think they can just come down from the mesas and take what they please. We're teaching her different." The girl said nothing. Her head was bowed, her breathing a ragged, desperate pant. Her people had a name for themselves, but Tendi was the one used in Ascension. It meant ghost, or shadow, or something less than human, depending on who was saying it. It was then that Hatch Morrow moved. He had been standing near the farriers, the smell of burnt hoof and hot metal familiar and grounding. He was a man built of long, quiet lines, his face weathered by more than just this sun, his eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He had been watching not the girl, not the men, but the rope. He knew ropes. He knew the sounds they made when they were stretched to their limit, whether holding a supplies bundle or a man's weight. He knew the particular friction of hemp on skin. He had a rifle with him, a new one. Not his rifle. That one was buried deep under a cairn of stones 1,000 miles north, in a land of snow and silence, its stock warped and its barrel filled with frozen earth. But a man alone in this country needed a rifle. This one was a Winchester, oiled and functional. He'd bought it 2 towns back, and it felt alien in his hands, a tool for a trade he no longer practiced. He had it cradled in the crook of his arm, his thumb resting near the breech. He watched the rope snap taut. He saw the girl's body arch in a silent scream. And something inside him, a thing he thought had been killed and buried in that blizzard war, shifted. It was not anger. Anger was a fire, hot and quick. This was different. It was a cold, heavy weight, a settling of accounts. That's enough. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the heat and the silence. It was rusty, unused. Cale turned his head slowly, the motion of a predator interrupted at its meal. Jetty stopped walking, his hand tightening on the whip. The crowd stirred, a low murmur passing through them like wind through dry grass. Hatch took the Winchester from the crook of his arm. For a heart-stopping second, the men in the street tensed, Cale's hand drifting towards his hip. The crowd held its breath. But Hatch didn't raise the rifle. He didn't aim it. He bent at the waist, a slow, deliberate motion, and laid the rifle in the dust of the street. He placed it carefully, as if it were fragile, as if it were asleep. Then he straightened up. He unbuckled the gun belt at his waist, the one holding a small, functional revolver and a handful of cartridges. He let that fall to the ground, too, the thump muffled by the thick dust. He stood there, empty-handed, his palms open at his sides, and then he began to walk. He walked into the center of the street, into the full, brutal glare of the sun. He didn't look at Cale. He didn't look at Jetty. His gaze was fixed on the girl. Each step was measured, unhurried. The dust puffed up around his worn boots. The world seemed to shrink until it was only this narrow stage of sun-baked earth, with its actors and its silent watching chorus. "Mister," Cale said, a warning coiled in the single word. The horse shifted nervously, its ears twitching. "This ain't your affair." Hatch didn't answer. He just kept walking. His silence was more profound than any threat. It was an abyss. It sucked the sound and the certainty out of the air. It was the silence of the snow fields after the battle, the silence of a grave. Jetty, the younger man, took a half-step forward, puffing out his chest. He was less sure of himself, needing to fill the void Hatch's quiet had created. "You hear him? He said it ain't your affair. This is town business." He flicked the whip, and the tip cracked a foot from Hatch's boots. A small explosion of sound. Hatch didn't flinch. His eyes never left the girl. He could see the pulse beating in her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of skin. He could see the fine, dark hairs on her arms, caked with dust. He saw the place where the rope had worn through the skin on her wrists, a raw, weeping red. He saw her, and in her he saw another face, pale and wide-eyed in a swirl of driving snow, a face he had last seen through the sight of a rifle. The memory was a shard of ice in his gut. Cale laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound, meant to break the tension, to reassert his control. "Well, look at this. A goddamn saint, come to save the little thief." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "What's your stake in this, saint? You her pa? Or you just got a taste for tenda squaws?" The men in the crowd who had been on the verge of laughter did so now, a ragged, relieved sound. The spell was broken. This was familiar territory again, crude jokes, casual cruelty. The man was a fool, an unarmed fool. Hatch stopped. He was 10 feet from the girl, close enough to see her chest heave, to hear the rasp of her breath. He finally lifted his gaze from her and looked at Cale. His eyes were not pleading. They were not angry. They were just empty. It was the look of a man who had already lost everything that could be threatened. "Let her go," he said, his voice still low, still flat. "Or what?" Cale sneered, gesturing with his thumb at the rifle lying in the street. "You gonna shoot me with that dust? You gonna ask me real polite?" Hatch took another step, and another. Jetty shuffled his feet, his bravado leaking away into the thirsty ground. This wasn't right. A man was supposed to yell, to threaten, to bargain. He wasn't supposed to just walk, to just be. The silence was getting under his skin. It felt like judgment. "Cale," Jetty said, his voice softer now. "Cale, maybe—" "Shut up, Jetty," Cale snapped, his own composure starting to fray at the edges. The man's passivity was an accusation. It made Cale the villain in a play he hadn't known he was writing. He needed to re-establish the rules. He yanked hard on the rope. The girl cried out, a thin, strangled sound, as her body was jolted forward. She fell hard, her chin striking the ground. She lay there, limp, a broken doll in the dirt. And Hatch kept walking. He didn't rush. He didn't run. The same measured pace. He was a force of nature now, like a slow-moving flood or a creeping frost. Inevitable. He walked past the horse's head. He walked towards the girl. He knelt in the dust beside her. "Get away from her!" Cale snarled, his voice tight with fury. He swung himself down from the saddle, his boots landing with a heavy thud. The air crackled. Now it was man to man. The crowd surged forward a little, craning their necks. Hatch ignored him. He reached out, his hands moving with a surgeon's care. He touched the rope, not the girl. His fingers worked at the knot that bound the rope to the twine around her wrists. It was a cruel knot, designed to tighten with every pull. His hands were steady, his focus absolute. Cale stood over him, his shadow falling across Hatch and the girl. "I said, get away!" He drew his Colt, the click of the hammer being pulled back obscenely loud in the quiet street. The muzzle was a dark, perfect circle aimed at the back of Hatch's head. "Last time I'm going to tell you." The crowd went dead silent. The shame was beginning to curdle in the air. This was no longer a lesson for a thief. This was about to be a murder over a man kneeling in the dirt. They looked at each other, their own reflections caught in their neighbors' eyes. They saw their silence, their complicity. The entertainment had soured. Mr. Abernathy, the mercantile owner, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, took a half-step back into the shadows of his store, as if to distance himself from the outcome he had set in motion. Hatch didn't look up. His fingers kept working at the knot. He could feel the heat of the gun barrel near his skull, a focused, malevolent warmth. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on his back. He could feel the ghost of the blizzard wind on his neck. He had faced death before. This was different. This time it was a choice. He worked the knot free. The long rope fell away, landing in the dust with a soft sigh. He then moved to the twine cutting into her wrists. It was embedded deep, and blood welled up as he gently worked to loosen it. The girl stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of dark, wet earth, ancient and deep. She looked not at the man looming over them with the gun, but at Hatch's face, so close to hers. She saw the lines etched around his eyes. She saw the scar that cut through his left eyebrow. She saw the profound, bottomless weariness there. And she saw something else, something familiar. A stillness, the stillness of a mountain that has endured 1,000 storms. It was a look she knew from her own people, from the old ones who had seen the world change and their lands shrink. It was the face of a survivor who carried his dead within him. Cale's knuckles were white around the grip of his Colt. The whole town was watching. He couldn't back down. But killing an unarmed man who was kneeling, helping someone, something in him balked. The story of this day would change. He would no longer be the enforcer of justice. He would be a butcher. He could feel the narrative shifting under his feet, the ground becoming unstable. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Hatch finally freed her wrists. He didn't have a cloth, so he used the sleeve of his own shirt to gently blot the blood. He moved slowly, as if she were a frightened animal. Then, still on his knees, he looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer words of comfort. He just held her gaze. It was a simple, human act of recognition. "I see you." The girl pushed herself up, wincing. She sat back on her heels, never taking her eyes off Hatch. Hatch then turned his head, looking up at Cale from his kneeling position. The gun was still aimed at his face. He didn't speak. He just looked. He let Cale see the man he was about to kill. He let him feel the weight of the act. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 3. It became unbearable. It was filled with the breathing of the crowd, the buzz of a fly, the distant clang of the farrier's hammer, a sound from a world where things were still being made, not destroyed. A woman in the crowd, her face a harsh geography of sun and worry, muttered, "For God's sake, Cale, she's just a child." The words, spoken softly, landed like a hammer blow. The consensus was broken. The single mind of the crowd fractured. Cale's authority, which rested on their silent approval, crumbled. He looked around, his eyes darting from face to face, and saw not support, but judgment. He saw disgust. He saw their shame, and it was a mirror to his own. He lowered the gun. His hand was shaking. He spat on the ground, a futile gesture of defiance. "Get her out of my town," he snarled, not at Hatch, but at the girl. "If I see her again, I'll finish it." He holstered his Colt with a clumsy, angry motion and stalked back to his horse, yanking the reins with unnecessary force. Jetty, looking pale and sick, scurried to pick up the long rope from the dust, coiling it as he backed away, his eyes wide. He avoided looking at Hatch, at the girl, at anyone. Cale swung himself into the saddle. "What are you all looking at?" he roared at the crowd. "Show's over!" He spurred his horse and galloped down the street, Jetty jogging awkwardly behind him, disappearing in a cloud of their own dust. The street was quiet again, but the stillness was different now. It was filled with the residue of what had almost happened, and what had. The crowd began to disperse, melting back into the shops and alleys. They moved quietly, their faces averted, not looking at the man and the girl kneeling in the center of the road. They didn't want to meet his eyes. They didn't want to acknowledge the choice he had made, that they had not. They picked up their parcels, they checked their wagon hitches, they went about the business of forgetting. Hatch remained on his knees for a moment longer. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind a deep, aching fatigue. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting. He looked down at his shirt sleeve, dark and stained. He looked at his rifle, lying forgotten in the dust. He felt no urge to pick it up. The girl watched him. She rose to her feet, slowly, unsteadily. She stood before him, small and fragile, yet her eyes held a strength that belied her size. She looked at his face, then her gaze flickered to his empty hands. She spoke. Her voice was low and raspy, the words foreign, shaped by a different tongue. They were soft, with clicks and long vowels, the sound of water flowing over smooth stones. It was a language older than the steel rails that cut through the territory, older than the gallows that stood in the county seat, older than the very name of the town of Ascension. She gestured with her chin, a small, subtle movement, towards the north, towards the distant hazy line of the mesas that shimmered in the heat. She said the words again, and this time she pointed, not with her finger, but with her lips, in the way of her people. It was an invitation, or a statement, a recognition that his path and hers were now intertwined. Then she turned and began to walk. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She walked with a stiff, painful gait, her back straight, her head held high. She walked away from the town, away from the storefronts and the silent, shamed people. She walked towards the open, unforgiving land from which she had come. Hatch stood for a long moment in the empty street. The sun beat down on his head. He looked at his rifle, the tool of his old life. He looked at the dust where the girl had fallen. He looked at the blood on his sleeve. The blizzard was far away, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the cold of its memory. He felt something else, a pull. a purpose. He bent down and picked up his gun belt, buckling it back on out of habit, a gesture of a life that was already behind him. He left the rifle where it lay, a gift to the dust. He looked north, at the small, retreating figure of the girl. He could see the mesas, a promise of height and distance, and a world governed by different laws. He was following her back to where the rope first began. He put one foot in front of the other and began to walk, his own long shadow stretching out before him on the road away from Ascension. The heat did not lessen as they left the town behind. The world opened up into a vast, indifferent expanse of creosote bush and pale, cracked earth. The mesas were a mirage in the distance, their colors shifting from ochre to purple as the sun arced across the sky. The girl did not set a fast pace. She couldn't. Her feet were cut and bruised, and every step was a carefully managed negotiation with pain. But she did not stop. Her endurance was a quiet, stubborn thing, like a desert plant that survives on memory of rain. Hatch walked about 10 paces behind her. He gave her space. This wasn't his world. He was a trespasser here. He watched the way she moved, the way her eyes scanned the horizon, noting landmarks invisible to him, a particular configuration of rocks, a solitary, skeletal juniper tree, the subtle dip and rise of the land. She was not lost. She was navigating a map written in a language he couldn't read. He said nothing. There were no words he possessed that seemed adequate. "Are you all right?" was a foolish question. "Where are we going?" was irrelevant. He had made his choice back in the street, and the choice was to follow. The rest was detail. His own thirst began to assert itself, a dry, rasping need in his throat. He had a canteen, half full, but he waited. He watched her, and when he saw her, steps begin to falter, her small frame swaying with the first signs of heat sickness, he walked faster to close the distance between them. He came up alongside her. She glanced at him, her face a mask of exhaustion, but her eyes were wary, alert. He didn't speak. He simply unhooked his canteen and held it out to her. She stared at it for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face, looking for the hook, the angle, the price. It was the look of someone for whom kindness had always been a trap. He just held it steady, his arm outstretched. Finally, her gaze softened almost imperceptibly. She took the canteen. Her hands, scraped and raw, fumbled with the cap. She drank, not greedily, but in small, measured sips as if rationing the gift. When she was done, she screwed the cap back on and handed it back to him, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was hot and dry. She gave a small, almost formal nod of her head. It was the first gesture of trust between them. She turned and continued walking, her steps a little steadier now. Hatch took a small sip for himself and fell back into his position behind her. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and red. The heat lingered, but the direct assault lessened. The shadows of the saguaros stretched out like long, skeletal fingers across the desert floor. As dusk settled, a deep velvet purple, the girl finally stopped. She had led them to a shallow arroyo, a dry wash carved by flash floods that came only a few times a year. It offered some protection from the wind that was beginning to pick up, a cool breath in the vast emptiness. She sank to the ground, her back against the sandy bank, and drew her knees to her chest, a posture of conservation, of holding herself together. Hatch didn't build a fire. A fire was a signal, a beacon, and he didn't know who might be watching. He sat a short distance away, his back against the opposite bank, giving her the illusion of solitude while still being close enough to be a guardian. The silence between them was no longer the tense, confrontational silence of the town street. It was older, deeper, the silence of the desert itself, filled with the scuttling of unseen things, the cry of a distant coyote, the sigh of the wind. He took out a small, hard biscuit from his saddlebag. He'd gone back for his horse after they were well clear of the town, finding it tethered where he'd left it, untouched, and a piece of jerky. He ate slowly, methodically. He offered some to her, placing it on a flat rock midway between them. She watched him for a long time before she crept forward and took it, retreating back to her spot to eat in the same careful, rationing way she had drunk the water. In the faint light of the rising moon, he could see the details of her face more clearly. The high cheekbones, the straight, proud line of her nose. There was bruising on her cheek, a dark shadow against her skin. She finished the biscuit and then, unexpectedly, she spoke. The word was she. She touched her own chest. Then she looked at him, her expression questioning. Hatch understood. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. His own name felt like a borrowed coat, something that belonged to a different man. Hatch, he said. The name felt rough in his own mouth. She tried to repeat it. Hatch, she said, the T sound soft, almost non-existent. She nodded as if filing the information away. She. Hatch. They were no longer just a girl and a stranger. They had names. She then spoke a few more words in her language, her voice soft. She pointed to her feet, then made a gesture that suggested walking a long distance. She touched her stomach and made a face of hunger. Then she held up 3 fingers and pointed back in the direction of ascension, 3 tins of peaches. It was a confession, an explanation, offered not with shame, but as a statement of fact. Her people were hungry. She had walked a long way. She had done what was necessary. Hatch just nodded, his face unreadable in the dim light. He understood more than just her words. He understood necessity. He had seen it in the eyes of starving men in the war, men who would kill for a moldy piece of bread. He had seen it in his own reflection. The girl, she, pulled her thin shift tighter around her. The desert night was growing cold, the day's heat bleeding away into the vast, dark sky. Hatch took the worn wool blanket from his saddle roll. It was his only one. It smelled of horse and dust and wood smoke. He walked over to her. She flinched as he approached, a small, involuntary movement, her body remembering the proximity of men who meant her harm. He stopped, holding the blanket out. He didn't try to put it around her. He just offered it. She looked at the blanket, then at his face. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the instinct to refuse, to remain self-sufficient, warring with the simple animal need for warmth. Her shivering gave her away. She reached out and took the blanket, her fingers brushing his again. She wrapped it around her shoulders, huddling deep within its folds. She looked up at him and spoke another word. It was soft, questioning. Dine? Hatch frowned slightly, not understanding. She repeated it. Dine? Then gestured to herself, and then swept her hand out towards the dark mesas, the people. Then she looked at him, her head tilted. She was asking who he was, not his name, but his people. Where did he belong? Hatch had no answer. His people were scattered, buried in eastern churchyards or lost to westward fevers. He had no piece of land that claimed him. He was adrift. He looked out at the mesas, at the impossible number of stars burning in the blackness. He thought of the blizzard, of the white, featureless landscape where he had lost himself. He had been part of a people then, an army, but that belonging had been a lie, a uniform that covered a hollow man. He looked back at her and slowly shook his head. He had no answer to give. He was just Hatch. She seemed to understand. Her gaze was not pitying. It was knowing. She, who belonged so fiercely to a place and a people, seemed to understand what it was to be unbelonged. She pulled the blanket tighter, turned her face away, and settled herself for sleep. Hatch returned to his spot and sat through the night, his back against the cool sand. He did not sleep. He kept watch. He listened to the desert's nocturnal symphony and watched the moon trace its silver path across the sky. He was guarding the girl, but he was also guarding something else. A small, fragile flicker of something in himself that he had thought long extinguished. In the street, he had put down his rifle. Here, in the vast, silent dark, he was beginning to understand that he had picked up something far heavier. They walked for 2 more days. The landscape grew harsher, then strangely more beautiful. The flat, scrubby desert began to tilt upwards, breaking into canyons and arroyos, the rock turning from pale sandstone to a deep, visceral red. The heat was still a hammer, but there were now places to hide from it, overhangs of rock and the deep shade of narrow slot canyons. She knew them all. She moved through the terrain, not like someone crossing it, but like someone who was a part of it. She showed him where to find water, a seep hidden beneath a cluster of ferns in a shaded alcove, the water cool and tasting of stone. She pointed out plants, naming them in her language. One was for burns, another for a fever. Another, with a milky sap, was a poison for arrows. Her knowledge was practical, ancient, and absolute. Hatch learned to be quiet in a new way, not the stoic, burdened silence of his isolation, but a receptive silence. He learned to listen to the sound of her breathing to gauge her exhaustion. He learned to watch her hands to see what she was teaching him. He learned the subtle language of her posture, the slight tensing of her shoulders that meant she sensed something, a snake in the rocks, the scent of a predator on the wind. Their shared vocabulary grew, a sparse collection of words strung between 2 vastly different worlds. To was water. Chi'il was a plant. Jiu was a mountain. He taught her horse and blanket and sky. Each new word was a small, carefully laid stone in a bridge being built between them. On the 3rd afternoon, as they rested in the shade of a towering rock formation that looked like a sentinel, she tended to her own feet. They were a raw, swollen mess. Hatch watched for a moment, then went to his saddlebag. He carried a small kit, a habit from the war. It contained a few clean rags, a tin of salve, and a needle and thread. He knelt in front of her, wordlessly indicating her feet. She recoiled, pulling them back under her. Her eyes flashed with defiance. To allow him to touch her feet was an act of profound vulnerability. It was a submission she was not prepared to make. Hatch didn't insist. He simply opened the tin of salve and placed it on the ground before her, along with a clean strip of cloth. He retreated to his previous spot and turned his back, giving her privacy. He sat and stared at the rock wall, at the lines and fissures that told a story millions of years old. He heard the faint sound of her sharp intake of breath as she touched the raw skin, the soft rustle of the cloth. When he finally glanced back, she had treated her feet as best she could and was wrapping them in the strips of rag. It was a clumsy job, but it was hers. She had accepted the tool, but not the hand. He understood the distinction. Later that day, they saw them. 2 riders high on a ridge to the east, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. They were too far to make out details, but they were not moving. They were watching. She saw them at the same instant he did. She froze, her body going utterly still. She melted back against a rock outcropping, her dark skin and dun-colored shift blending into the shadows. She was instantly invisible. Hatch pulled his horse behind a jumble of boulders. He drew the revolver from his hip, the weight of it suddenly heavy and ugly in his hand. He peered over the rock, his eyes narrowed. He was a sharpshooter by training. He knew how to read distance, wind, and intention. These men were not drifters. They sat their horses with a purpose. They were looking for something, for them. Cale? He asked her in a low voice, using the name of the man from Ascension. She shook her head. She spoke a word in her language, her voice tight with a fear that was different from the fear in the town. This was older, deeper. The word was Ana'i. It was a word that meant more than just enemy. It carried the weight of generations of conflict. It meant the ones who are against us. She pointed to the west, to a deep, shadowed cleft in the nearby canyon wall. She was indicating a new path, a way to get below the sight line of the riders on the ridge. It would be harder going, but safer. He nodded his understanding. The hunt had changed. It was no longer about a deputy from a dusty town. This was something else. This was part of the story that had begun long before the stolen peaches. They moved quickly, scrambling down a steep, rocky decline into the canyon. The air grew cooler, the sunlight only reaching the floor in narrow, brilliant shafts. The walls were sheer and red, carved with the abstract patterns of wind and water. The sound of their movements echoed strangely in the enclosed space. She was agile, moving with a mountain goat's certainty, her wrapped feet finding holds he couldn't see. They followed the canyon floor for an hour, twisting and turning until it opened into a wider, more secluded basin. In the center of the basin stood a ruin. It wasn't large, the collapsed stone walls of a few small, circular structures, but it was clearly ancient. The stones were fitted together without mortar, weathered by centuries of sun and wind. In the center was a symbol carved into a flat rock, a spiral, the universal sign of the journey, of emergence. She walked to the center of the ruin and touched the spiral with the palm of her hand. Her shoulders, which had been tense with fear, relaxed. She was home, not her house, but her place, a place of power and memory. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer or recitation. Hatch stayed at the edge of the ruin, feeling like an intruder. This place was sacred, and his presence felt like a desecration. He looked back the way they had come, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The quiet of the basin was profound, but it felt temporary, a fragile bubble of peace in a world of threats. When she opened her eyes, the fear was gone. In its place was a calm, solemn resolve. She looked at Hatch, and her gaze was direct, weighing him. She spoke, and her tone was different now. It was not the voice of a rescued victim. It was the voice of someone who was about to set the terms. She spoke in her own language, using gestures to bridge the gaps. She pointed back towards the riders, towards Ascension. She made a shape with her hands like a house, then a gesture for many people. She touched her own stomach, the sign for hunger. Then she made a new gesture, one he hadn't seen. She scooped her hands as if gathering grain, but her face was grim. Then she made a motion like her hands were being tied. They had taken their food. They had taken their people. The story was becoming clearer. The theft of the peaches was not an isolated act of a hungry girl. It was an act of desperation, of defiance, a small answer to a much larger crime. The men back in Ascension, Mr. Abernathy with his sweat-stained collar, they weren't just punishing a thief. They were starving a people into submission, into moving off the land they wanted for cattle, for mining, for a railroad that was rumored to be coming through. The rope in the street was just the visible end of a much longer, invisible chain of subjugation, and the riders on the ridge, the Anai. They were part of it too. Hired guns, perhaps, or rivals from another tribe, pushed into conflict by the shrinking resources, set against each other by the white men who profited from the chaos. She then looked at Hatch, at the gun on his hip. She said the word Anai again, and this time she pointed at him. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question. Are you one of them? It was the same question she had asked with the word Diné. Who are you? Where do you stand? Hatch looked down at the colt in his hand. It felt like a part of the disease, a tool of the world that had created Cale and Abernathy and the riders on the hill, a world that had created the Blizzard War and the man he had become. He remembered laying his rifle in the dust. That had been an act of instinct. This was a choice, informed by the hard miles he had just walked. He pulled the revolver from its holster. The metal was warm from his body. He looked at the cylinder, the 6 waiting cartridges. He thought of the woman in the snow, the recoil of his rifle, the way her body had fallen with such finality. He opened the loading gate and, one by one, he ejected the cartridges, letting them fall to the red earth at his feet. They landed with small, soft clicks. He let all 6 of them fall. Then he held out the empty gun to she. He didn't know the word for peace, or for trust, or for atonement. He didn't have the language for the vow he was making, but he knew this gesture, the gesture of a soldier disarming before a parley, the gesture of a man choosing a side. She stared at the empty gun, then at his face. For the first time, a flicker of something like a smile touched her lips. It was a small, sad, beautiful thing. She did not take the gun. She shook her head, a slight gesture. She didn't want his weapon. She wanted him without it. She then turned and pointed towards the far side of the basin, where the canyon wall rose up in a series of steep, broken cliffs. There was a path there, almost invisible, a narrow track that zigzagged up the face of the rock. It was the way home. The final part of the journey. She looked at him one last time, a look of challenge and invitation. The choice was his, to stay here, in the relative safety of the basin, or to follow her into the heart of her world, into the danger she had fled and was now returning to face, to truly see where the rope began. Hatch holstered the empty revolver. It was just a piece of metal now, a useless weight on his hip, a reminder of a promise. He gave a single, firm nod. He would follow. The climb was treacherous. It was less a path and more a suggestion, a route followed by generations who knew every handhold and foothold. She moved with an unnerving grace, her small body light and certain. Hatch, taller and heavier, struggled. His worn boots slipped on the smooth rock. His hands, unaccustomed to this kind of labor, were scraped raw. He moved slowly, deliberately, focusing on each move, the world shrinking to the few feet of rock in front of him. The higher they climbed, the more the world below opened up, the basin and the ruin shrinking until they were just a drawing on the desert floor. He could feel the burn in his lungs, the ache in his muscles. It was a cleansing pain, a physical penance. With every foot of elevation, he felt like he was leaving something of his old self behind. The man who rode into ascension, the man who carried the weight of the blizzard, was being shed layer by layer on this cliff face. Near the top, as the sun was beginning to touch the western horizon, they paused on a narrow ledge. She was looking back, not at him, but at the land they had crossed. From this height, they could see for miles. He followed her gaze. The 2 riders were still there, no longer on the ridge, but moving now, down in the desert flats, heading in their general direction. They were following their tracks. They were patient. She's face was grim. She looked at Hatch, and a silent understanding passed between them. They were bringing trouble to her home. Her act of returning, and his act of following, had consequences. She turned and resumed the climb, moving with a renewed urgency. The last stretch was the hardest, a near-vertical scramble up a fissure in the rock. Hatch pulled himself over the final ledge and collapsed, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat. He was on the mesa top. The world was different here. The air was thinner, cooler. The ground was not red rock but sandy soil, dotted with hardy grasses and small, twisted piñon pines. The sky felt immense, closer, the colors of the sunset bleeding across the entire dome of the heavens. It was a place of profound, wind-swept beauty, and it was inhabited. Not far from the cliff edge was a settlement. It was not a town of straight lines and adobe walls like Ascension. It was a scattering of hogans, the traditional dwellings of the Dene, circular homes made of mud and logs, their doorways facing east to greet the rising sun. Smoke curled from the smoke holes of a few, a thin, fragrant haze of burning piñon. A few sheep and goats bleated in a corral made of gnarled branches. But the place was quiet. Too quiet. There were no children playing, no dogs barking, no sounds of conversation. An air of grief and apprehension hung over it, as tangible as the wood smoke. An old man emerged from the largest of the hogans. He was tall and lean, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles. His long gray hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore a traditional woven blanket over his shoulders, its geometric patterns telling a story of their own. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes holding the same ancient stillness that Hatch had first seen in She. He saw She, and his stern expression softened with relief. He said her name, his voice a low rumble. He walked to her, and she went to him, leaning her head against his chest for a moment, a gesture of a weary child returning home. He put a hand on her head, a silent blessing. Then the old man's eyes fell on Hatch. They were piercing, intelligent eyes, and they missed nothing. They took in his non-Diné face, his dusty, sweat-stained clothes, the useless revolver at his hip. There was no welcome in his gaze, only suspicion and a deep, bottomless sorrow. Other people began to emerge from the hogans, drawn by the arrival. An older woman with a face as strong and patient as the earth itself. A few young men, their faces tight with anger and grief. A handful of women and children, their eyes wide and fearful. There were not many of them. No more than 20 people in all. It was a remnant, a family holding on at the edge of the world. The old man spoke to She in their language, his voice questioning. She answered him, her voice low and steady. She told her story. Hatch couldn't understand the words, but he could read the narrative in her gestures, in the reactions of the people listening. She spoke of the town, of the rope. Her hand sketched the shape of Hatch stepping forward, of him laying down his rifle. She pointed to her wrapped feet and the salve he had given her. She told them of the riders, the Ana'i. As she spoke, the faces of the people turned towards Hatch. Their expressions shifted from pure suspicion to a complex mixture of curiosity, confusion, and a reluctant, cautious gratitude. He stood apart from them, an awkward, silent giant, feeling the weight of their collective gaze. He was the stranger, the outsider, the man who belonged to the world that was destroying theirs, and yet he was the one who had brought their daughter back. When she finished, the old man, who Hatch learned was her grandfather, Hastien Sosi, looked at Hatch for a long time. Finally, he spoke, not to Hatch, but to one of the young men, who then stepped forward. This young man's name was Bitani. His face was a mask of grief, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Bitani spoke to Hatch in heavily accented, broken English. "My grandfather asks why you are here." Hatch looked from the angry young man to the wise old one. He had no simple answer. "I followed her," he said, his voice hoarse. "She says you helped her," Bitani said, the words sounding like an accusation, as if the act of helping was itself suspicious. "She says you fought no one. You used no gun." "There was no need," Hatch said. "There is always need for a gun," Bitani countered, his hand dropping to the handle of a large knife tucked into his belt. "The Bilagana," the white men, "they listen only to guns." He spat the word Bilagana like a curse. Hastien Sosi said something sharp in Diné, and Bitani fell silent, his jaw tight. The old man then took a step towards Hatch. He looked at Hatch's eyes, and it felt as though he were looking directly into his soul, seeing all the broken and empty places there. He saw the blizzard and the ghost of the woman Hatch had killed. He saw the years of wandering, the heavy blanket of guilt. The old man spoke again, his voice softer now. Bitani translated, his tone grudging. "He says a man who puts down his weapon when his enemy holds a gun to his head is either a fool or a holy man. He is not sure which you are." Hatch met the old man's gaze. "I'm not a holy man," he said quietly. "Then you are a fool," Bitani snapped. Hastien Sosi ignored his grandson. He continued to study Hatch. Then he nodded, a slow, solemn gesture. It was an acceptance of a kind, not a welcome, but an acknowledgement. He spoke again. "He says you have brought our daughter home, and for this, we owe you water and food and a place to rest. Bitani translated. He says you have also brought the Anai to our door. For this, we may all pay a price. The old man turned and walked back towards his hogan, his message delivered. The interview was over. She's mother, the strong-faced woman, came forward and silently beckoned for Hatch to follow. She led him to a small, empty hogan at the edge of the settlement. Inside, it was cool and dark and smelled of earth and old smoke. A sheepskin was laid out on the floor for him. She left a bowl of water and a small cake of blue cornmeal by the door, then departed without a word. Hatch sat on the sheepskin in the silent hogan. The weight of the last few days crashed down on him. He was in the heart of the world he had only glimpsed from a distance. He had followed the rope back to its beginning, and found a people hanging on by a thread. He had tried to do one small, decent thing, and in doing so, he had inserted himself into a story of pain and injustice that was far older and more complex than he could have imagined. He had laid down his rifle in the street, but the war had followed him here. He looked out the eastern-facing door as night fell over the mesa. The sky was a riot of stars. He thought of the riders, the Anai, making their camp somewhere down in the darkness. They would come with the sun, and he, the unarmed fool, was now among the people they were coming for. He had made his stand in Ascension without a weapon. He wondered what kind of stand he could make here, with nothing but his silence and the heavy memory of all the times he had failed to be a decent man. Sleep did not come. He lay on the sheepskin, the empty revolver digging into his hip, a talisman of his new vow. He listened to the sounds of the settlement, a crying child, quickly soothed, the low murmur of voices from the main hogan, Hasti and Sosi and the others, planning, worrying, the lonely howl of a coyote answered from far across the canyon. These were the sounds of a life that was both fragile and fiercely persistent. Sometime before dawn, the murmur of voices ceased. The settlement fell into a deep, watchful quiet. Hatch rose and went to the doorway, looking out at the eastern horizon, which was just beginning to pale from black to a deep, bruised purple. The air was cold and sharp. He was not the only one awake. Hasti and Sosi stood outside his hogan, a solitary figure wrapped in his blanket, facing the dawn. He was chanting, his voice a low, melodic prayer, a conversation with the holy people, with the coming day. It was a prayer for balance, for harmony, for protection in a world that had fallen out of Hojo, out of balance. As the first sliver of the sun broke over the distant mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the mesa, a new sound reached them, the clink of shod hooves on rock. They were coming. Bitani and the other two young men emerged from their hogans. They carried old rifles, a motley collection of surplus army carbines and hunting pieces. Their faces were set, their movements economical. They were not warriors from a storybook. They were terrified, angry boys preparing to defend their home. They took up positions among the rocks at the edge of the settlement, their backs to the people they were protecting. She appeared at Hatch's side, a ghost in the gray light. She held a bow, beautifully made, and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. Her face was calm, the face she had worn in the ruin. She was no longer a child. She was a defender of her people, ready to use the knowledge of the poisonous sap if she had to. Hatch stood beside her, his hands empty. He felt a profound, aching helplessness. He was a sharpshooter, one of the best his regiment had ever seen. He could have taken those rifles from the young men and made every shot count. He could have been their greatest asset. But he had made a promise to himself, to the ghost in the snow, to the girl at his side. He had laid down that part of himself with his rifle in the street. The riders appeared at the top of the trail they had climbed yesterday. There were 4 of them, not 2. The other 2 must have been waiting below. They were hard-looking men, Bilagana, not Dine. They wore range clothes and carried repeating rifles held casually across their saddles. They looked like the kind of men who worked for cattle barons or railroad prospectors, men who were paid to clear problems off the land. They were led by a man with a graying beard and cold, pale eyes. He was the one who had been watching from the ridge. They stopped their horses 100 yards from the settlement, a comfortable rifle distance. They didn't seem surprised to find the place inhabited. This was their destination. The lead rider, the man with the beard, raised a hand, palm open, a mockery of a peaceful gesture. "Hastin Chosi," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "We need to talk." The old man did not move from his spot. He did not answer. His prayer chant had ended, and now he stood in silent communion with the morning. His stillness was his shield. The bearded man's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Don't be like that, old man. Mr. Abernathy sent us. He's a patient man, but his patience is wearing thin. You and your people are on his grazing lease. He's given you notice. It's time to move on." "This is not his land!" Batani shouted from the rocks, his voice high and cracking with fury. "This is Dineta! Our people have lived here since the beginning!" The rider chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "This is territorial land now, son. Bought and paid for. Your time here is over. Pack your things and head north to the reservation. Nothing for you here but trouble." Hastian Tsosi finally turned his head. He looked not at the riders, but at Hatch. His gaze was intense, questioning. "You are from their world. What do you do now?" Hatch felt the eyes of the entire family on him. She, Batani, the old woman, the children. He had walked into their lives, a harbinger of both help and destruction. This was his moment of accounting. The confrontation in Ascension was just a rehearsal. He began to walk. He walked out from the shelter of the Hogans into the open space between the settlement and the riders. He walked with the same slow, deliberate pace he had used in the street. He was unarmed, his hands open at his sides. He was a solitary, inexplicable figure in the middle of a deadly standoff. The bearded rider's eyes narrowed. "Well now, what have we here? I recognize you. You're the fool from Ascension." His men shifted in their saddles, their rifles no longer held so casually. "You've picked the wrong side, friend. These people can't pay you what Abernathy pays us." Hatch didn't stop until he was halfway between the two groups. He stood there, a man caught in the crossfire. He looked at the bearded rider. "The girl stole 3 tins of peaches," he said, his voice calm and clear. "You're here to kill 20 people over 3 tins of peaches." The rider laughed. "This ain't about peaches, you idiot. It's about the land. It's about a railroad survey coming through next month. There's money to be made, and these people are in the way. That's all. It's just business." "Turn around," Hatch said. "Ride away." "Is that a threat?" The rider's amusement was gone, replaced by irritation. "I see an empty holster on your hip. You going to bore me to death with talk?" "It's a choice," Hatch said. "The one you have right now. You can ride away, and this day is just another day. Or you can start shooting, and you'll have to live with what happens." "And what's that? A few boys with old hunting guns? An old man chanting at the sun?" The rider gestured dismissively towards the settlement. "No," Hatch said, and his voice dropped lower, drawing them in. "You'll have to live with killing them, with killing the children." He let the word hang in the air. "You'll have to remember their faces, just like I do." For the first time, a flicker of something other than arrogance showed on the rider's face. Hatch's tone was not challenging. It was intimate. It was a confession. He was speaking from a place of terrible experience. He was sharing the map of his own personal hell. "I killed a woman once," Hatch continued, his gaze locked with the rider's. "In a war. I was a long way off. It was snowing. I could barely see her. She wasn't even a soldier, just someone in the wrong place. I pulled the trigger, and she fell. and I have seen her face every single day since then. When I wake up, when I eat, when I try to sleep, she's always there." He took a step closer. The riders' horses shifted nervously, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The tension was no longer just about rifles and land, it was about ghosts. "You kill these people and you'll take them with you," Hatch said, his voice a near whisper, yet it seemed to carry all the way to the rocks where Bettani was hiding. "You'll see that old man's face when you're trying to spend the money Abernathy pays you. You'll hear those children crying when you're lying in the dark. You will carry them, all of them, for the rest of your life. Is the money worth that? Is this piece of dirt worth carrying a graveyard inside you?" The bearded man stared at him. The other riders looked at their leader, then at each other, their certainty wavering. They were hired guns, not monsters. They were paid to intimidate, to bully, to run people off, maybe even to kill if it came to it. But they had never had the consequences laid out for them so plainly, so personally. Hatch wasn't threatening their lives. He was threatening their peace of mind, what little they might have left. He was poisoning the money before it was even earned. "You're crazy," the rider said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Hatch agreed, "but I'm telling you the truth. You do this, and you'll end up like me. And trust me, you don't want that." He fell silent. He had said all he had to say. He had offered them the only weapon he had left, his own brokenness. He had shown them the wound that killing leaves on the killer. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The sun was higher now, the day warming. A bird sang from a twisted pine tree, a sound of heartbreaking normalcy. The bearded rider looked from Hatch's haunted face to the silent, watching figures of the Diné family. He looked at the old man who had not moved, a statue of moral authority. He looked at the boys in the rocks, who were willing to die for this place. He looked back at his own men, and he saw the doubt in their eyes. The business proposition had soured. The profit margin was suddenly crowded with ghosts. He cursed, a low, vicious sound. He gathered his reins. "This land ain't worth it," he muttered, to himself as much as to anyone. He turned his horse, not looking at Hatch, not looking at the settlement. "Let's go," he snarled at his men. One by one they turned their horses. They rode away, their backs stiff, their retreat full of a frustration that was close to shame. They disappeared back down the trail, the sound of their horses fading until there was only the wind and the song of the bird. No one moved. No one spoke. They watched until the riders were well and truly gone. Then Bettani stood up from behind the rocks, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He looked at Hatch, who was still standing alone in the open. The anger in the young man's face was gone, replaced by a profound, grudging respect. Hastiontsosi began to walk towards Hatch. She followed him. The whole family followed him, until they were all standing there, in the open, around the solitary white man. The old man stopped in front of him. He reached out and placed a hand on Hatch's shoulder. The touch was light, but it carried the weight of a benediction. He spoke, his voice soft, and this time Bettani's translation was not needed. The meaning was clear in his eyes, in his touch. "You are not a fool. You are not a holy man. You are a man who has shown us your soul, and you have saved ours." Hatch looked at the faces around him. He saw the relief, the cautious hope. He looked at she and saw in her eyes the same recognition he'd seen in the street in Ascension, but deeper now, forged in shared danger. He had followed her back to the beginning of the rope, and in doing so, he had found the end of his own, the end of the running. He did not know what would happen tomorrow. Abernathy would not give up. The world would not stop pressing in on this small patch of mesa. But for today, on this morning, there was peace. A peace that had been bought not with bullets, but with the truth of a wound. He looked at his hands. They were empty. They felt lighter than they had in years. He had buried a rifle in the snow and laid another in the dust. Here, on this mesa top, under the vast, clean sky, he felt he had finally buried the man who had used them. The war was over. His war. He was home, in a place he had never known, among a people who were not his, but who had shown him the way back to himself. The final moment had arrived, and it was not an ending, but a quiet, sunlit, and inevitable beginning.